Good morning and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Theologies of Bricks and Mortals, where we'll be discussing the theological and practical implications of houses of faith serving their larger communities. This will be sure to be a really fascinating conversation, especially with these panelists we have here. I'm Kate Toth, the Executive Director of Bricks and Mortals, which is a grassroots membership organization comprised of individuals and organizations from faith-based institutions and real estate experts. We connect congregations to experts and financial resources so houses of worship can thrive in New York City. You can find out more information about us at bricksandmortals.org. This event is also a Who is My Neighbor seminar organized by the Partnership for Faith-Based Affordable Housing and Community Development, of which Bricks and Mortals is a founding member. And finally, we'd like to thank the New York City Council for providing financial support for these seminars. Bricks and Mortals also has two upcoming events before the summer. Number one, Real Estate Planning 101 for Communities of Faith, co-sponsored with the American Institute of Architects. And two, Pre-Development and Affordable Housing, also co-sponsored with the partnership that I mentioned and with the New York City Speaker's Office. Go to our website to join the mailing list so you can be sure to get updates for these. So for the event today, please put any comments in the chat and any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be getting to your questions at around 11. With that, I'll hand it off to Peter Cook, who will be moderating today's event. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everyone to this seminar, Theologies of Bricks and Mortals. My name is Peter Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches, which is also part of the Partnership for Affordable Housing and Community Development, of which Bricks and Mortals, Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing, and Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative are also members. And together we work to help congregations in New York City and beyond to evaluate their property and in order to serve their community. We have some very distinguished panelists with us today, and I'd like to introduce them to you at this time. We have with us Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullove, who is a social psychiatrist who explores the ties between environment and mental health. She received her bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College and her MS and MD degrees from Columbia University. And she also completed a residency at New York Hospital, Westchester Division, and Montefiore, and is board certified in psychiatry. With her colleagues at the city's research group and the University of Orange, Mindy explores the consequences of social fracture for our society and our health, and seeks ways to connect the broken parts. And prior to joining the new school full-time in 2016, Mindy taught at Columbia University and was a lecturer at Parsons. Mindy's published numerous articles and 8 books, and I won't name all of them, but 2 I'll lift up: Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities, and Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America and What We Can Do About It. Rabbi Joe Tasnik is the Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis, which is the largest interdenominational rabbinic body in the world. Since 1972, he's been the spiritual and educational leader of Congregation Mount Sinai in Brooklyn Heights, New York. He's presently Rabbi Emeritus. He's served as chaplain of the New York City Fire Department since 1999 and had a high-profile helping many people cope with the disaster of 9/11. He's the co-host, along with Reverend A.R. Bernard of The Rev and The Rabbi, which airs every Sunday morning on WABC Talk Radio, 770 AM at 8 AM. And he's also a religious commentator for 1010 Winds Radio, succeeding the late Mark Tannenbaum. He's host of a TV program, Faith to Faith, on Jewish Broadcasting Service, which is seen around the country and invites people of all faiths to participate in meaningful conversation. Donna Scopper is one of the founders of Bricks and Mortals in New York City and has been senior pastor at Judson Memorial Church since 2005. She will be transitioning from that role in the May of 2022 and will become part-time pastor at the Orient Church on the far eastern end of Long Island. She's rewiring towards more writing and teaching and work with Bricks and Mortals to develop its next chapters. And her forthcoming book is RemoveThePews.com, Emptying in Order to Refill. And finally, we have the Reverend Dr. William Wilkinson, who is pastor and teaching elder of the First Presbyterian Church in Medina, New York. William brings his experience as a sociologist, hospital worker, sheet metal worker, physician, scientist. He has a MD from Yeshiva University, along with his theological education, and MDiv from Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, to the building of missional church and congregation-based community organization. Raised in Boston, Massachusetts, William began the practice of community partnership facilitation in the New England Peace Movement and deepened it in healthcare union struggles. 1199 SEIU in New York City, community-oriented public health in Kenya, East Africa, and as a sheet metal worker in Western New York. Reverend Wilkinson is engaged in the partnership and community chaplaincy ministries of Medina Area Association of Churches, the Harvest neighborhood of Presbyterian congregations in the Presbytery of Genesee Valley, and the Working Group on Race and Reconciliation of the Synod of the Northeast. So I would like to pose a question to our panelists, but in introduction to that question, I want to say that it's sometimes the case that religious communities lose their souls and vitality by focusing on themselves rather than on the communities they serve. Our buildings can sometimes become something we worship rather than seeing them as gifts from God, which can and must be used to give to others and to do justice in response to God's grace. Congregations are not fortresses. They are not country clubs. Instead, they need to see themselves as participants in a broad neighborhood and regional ecosystem where they contribute humanely and architecturally to foster relationships, create spaces which promote love, inclusion, and belonging. Sometimes we don't necessarily see our buildings as gifts. Instead, we see them as liabilities. They become, for us, decrepit shrines which cannot be maintained or improved because of shrinking resources and membership. But in these times, congregations can rediscover life if they do not let their imaginations be wounded. Instead, they can decide they will be resourceful and embrace a sense of mission where they dare to risk relationships with new people while asking others to help them bring their hopes and dreams to life. So I wanted to ask the panelists, how is it and why is it that congregations are called to care for their communities? And I'd like to have William, if he would begin by answering that question. Okay, why don't we try?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, William. How is it and why is it that congregations are called to care for their communities?
Well, from a theological perspective, I think that for me it is rooted in the history of our faith. That is to say, religions rise out of community. Theology rises out of people's experience. And our community historically is as a group of people usually facing slavery, oppression, empire, something which causes us to look to one another in our relationships to God for our sustenance. In my tradition, it begins with the Shema and the Israelite origins of our faith. There's one commandment: love God with everything you've got, which implies love everything that's God's. Goes to the 10 Commandments. It comes down to Jesus saying, love God, and in the same manner, love thy neighbor. And now to the United States, to the E pluribus unum, which Bishop Curry from the Episcopal Church characterizes when he quotes Cicero, that the reason for the one out of many is love makes the one out of many.
Great. So, Mindy, would you like to take a crack at that question? How is it and why is it that congregations are called to care for their communities?
I'm president of the congregation of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Essex County, which is in Orange, New Jersey. And the way we think about this is following the thought of St. James that faith without works is dead, and that the expression of our faith in Unitarianism, these are the 7 principles of our denomination, that we need to express this by being in partnership with people in our neighborhood, in our city, and in our region. So we think of it as the expression of, and perhaps in particular, the principle of the interdependence of all things in the web of life.
Great. And Rabbi Potasnik, would you care to reflect on that?
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to Bricks and Mortals for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Secondly, it's an honor to be with Reverend Wilkinson, a fellow Bostonian. So I look forward to strengthening that relationship. And Peter, you and I have come to know each other and confront various challenges, especially during this COVID period. So I commend you for your leadership. When you walk by many Jewish congregations, you will see the name of the congregation, but preceding the name, there are 2 Hebrew letters that are exactly the same. In Hebrew, it's Kuf, Kuf, and it stands for Kehillah Kedoshah, a holy congregation. What does that mean? It means that you're not just entering a building. This is not just about an edifice. This is about a place where together you can establish that spirit of holiness that is so vital. It's interesting that when you look at the Bible, God says, build a sanctuary and I will dwell in your midst. It doesn't say I will dwell in its midst. It says in your midst. And therefore, it is holiness within, which we feel is strengthened when we join together. But I also recognize that one of the things that congregations should remind us of this inner spirit is that just as in the Quaker tradition, which is services are conducted in silence. And I remember once going and I said to one of the ushers, when does the service begin? Because I had never seen that. He said, sir, the service begins when you walk out of the sanctuary. It's what you do on the outside that determines how sincere you were on the inside. So I think that we are mandated by our respective traditions to be impactful in our communities, to not just simply feel that a congregation is bound by walls. And we have a commitment that we must make to community. It's also important to note that prayers are written in the plural. It's not just about me, it's about we. So I think that's what we really are commanded to do when we build a congregation as part of a community.
Great. And finally, Donna, I wanted to know if you could reflect on that question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So religious institutions, like human beings, have a tendency to get old and closed. They have a tendency to rigidify the word of God and to make things static and to hope that things are static, especially people with power do that to religious institutions. The underprivileged keep praying that God will come and shake things up. And the older immigrant congregations, like my traditions, would really like things just to stay the way they used to be. And when Jesus confronted that problem long, long, long ago, and Jesus is the one I follow in this game of life, Jesus was confronting an ossified situation, a rigidified situation. And he caused what's a lot of people these days call good trouble. He caused good trouble and said, you know, it's not about this building. It's not about this moment. I could tear this temple down and rebuild it in 3 days. What a thing to say. Many, many scholars believe that's why he was crucified. And I believe it is a reason, not the only reason, but we're still afraid to love. We're still afraid to be open. And in the United Church of Christ, where I make my spiritual home, we say God is still speaking. Somebody saw a dog tied to the front door of the church and said, God is still barking. I thought that was a pretty line.
Love that.
Good way to make fun of our slogan. But when we say God is still speaking, we're saying that God is still active. God has something new to show us. So in Bricks and Mortals, our theology is about allowing religious institutions to stay open enough to live, to pray another day, another way. And we say to people who say, look, Pastor, these buildings are none of your business. You know, they have to do with the profane part of the world. We say back, oh, what a phony binary. Even Jesus talked about the best use of the temple. So let's open them up. Let's stay open. And let's even die a little to live a little more.
Great. So, Mindy, you've authored many books, and I think we were so privileged to have you present to us 3 years ago at Union Seminary, where you really laid out a vision for how communities are interconnected in terms of architecturally and in terms of human relationships, and that it's really important for religious institutions to relate to communities as a whole and to see them as ecosystems which are very, interconnected. And I wanted to know if we could kind of take another crack at this question by saying, how can communities kind of get over themselves and collaborate to serve their neighbors and municipal and regional residents?
Thanks for the question. It's an important question. One of the things that my research team has observed and that we've written about is the profound fracture in American society. We're not the only people observing this, of course, because it's very evident. And so the issue is, well, you have a very fractured society. How do people from one piece start talking to people from another piece? That's like the biggest challenge facing us. Whatever you want to think about, whatever list of crises or injustices you want to make, underlying all of that is that we aren't whole as a nation. So how do you get the pieces into relationship? And I think that one of the organizations that's really demonstrating how to do this is the People's Campaign, which has said, well, we have to actually not talk about what we believe, we have to talk about what we need, because human needs are the same. Everybody needs housing and they need food, and they need a little bit of entertainment. All of these things are aggravated in this moment by COVID. So everybody's been trying to manage COVID from whatever their position in society has been, but it's driven us further apart. It's been a very, very difficult year. So as we emerge from COVID, how are we going to emerge? Are we going to start to look after each other? Are we going to start to have some solidarity? That's the big question. And I think every community has an opportunity to say, what they understood from this past year, what they learned, what was revealed to them, and how do they want to go forward? So that's the challenge, a very serious challenge. So embracing it and becoming part of the solution, I think, is the road ahead. But I don't want to say that there is an answer, although I think dancing in the streets is a really good start. I'm really pushing dancing in the streets for this spring, and perhaps every congregation could hold a dance party in front of its building.
Why are dance parties important in terms of mission and building up building up our neighborhoods and our communities?
Well, it's not just mission, it's actual, everybody's had a hard year. And everybody wants to get back outside and be with other people. And this is an instruction, very clear instruction from Martha and the Vandellas, that you're supposed to dance in the streets. I know Donna got it because she laughed. Donna, how would you explain it? Why do we have to dance in the streets?
Yeah.
Because we have pent up joy and happiness, and it needs to go someplace. And when I talk about institutions getting ossified, when they're open, when they're excited, when they're glad to be alive and glad to be together, all they can do is dance. And it goes to the pattern and the praise part of religion. And when we go into the right and wrong part of religion, which is a part of religion, and when we just live there, we just become dull and our feet don't move well.
What she said so beautifully. That was awesome, Donna. Thanks.
I guess I would just build on that a little bit to say the word was dancing in the streets, not just dancing in our sanctuaries, although that's a good idea. But how is it that the church goes out into the world to celebrate with its community rather than seeing itself as the destination internally for the community? Although that's important too, but
Peter, can I just add something?
yeah, please.
It's interesting when you look at Jewish tradition, for example, the Talmud, which is the oral law, commentary on the written law, the Torah, there's no page 1. It starts on page 2. And I think there's a lesson there that sometimes in life, page 1 is taken from you and you have to learn how to begin again. I remember Elie Wiesel said, when you're born, you begin, and then you have to learn how to begin again. And I think after a year of COVID, it's important that we begin again, as Professor said, in a celebratory fashion. I was talking to a group of young people recently. We talked about anti-Semitism. Then I said to them, we cannot have Judaism predicated totally on anti-Semitism. If that's what it's all about, then people are going to say, why should I belong? If it's all about pain, if it's all about struggle, then there's no joy in it. I think we have to maximize those special moments when we can join together and say, this is a moment of beauty. This is a moment, as you say, of celebration. Years ago, when we would have tickets to go to an event, it would say on the ticket, no good if detached. And I think we've learned that lesson. We can't be good if we're detached from one another. And I believe that COVID has reminded us that we are interdependent. And therefore, I think that dancing in the streets, I would recommend we all dance with other groups, because we have found that some of our celebrations that we were able to have were okay, but we yearn to join with other people in celebrating. So I'd love to see churches and synagogues and all of us come together in some meaningful way and say, this is our moment. This is the time for all of us. This is what we've been waiting for. So I do think dancing in the streets, but dancing in the streets with others, not just with our own.
So William, would you like to add to this reflection here?
I'm just going to listen for the moment.
Oh, okay. All right. So what might be some really tangible things that people could do in their congregations to kind of get over themselves and be out in the streets? You know, are there some best practices or approaches that you might suggest?
Well, you're talking about after the dance party.
After the dance party, although the dance party is important. So
Yeah, the dance party is essential. It's not just important, it's essential,
yeah,
because it's a very, pent up joy and pent up suffering and pent up need for each other. These have to be acknowledged in the public space. And after the dance party, it's a different world. Then we're a little bit calmer. People are quite frantic right now because they've been apart from each other.
mhm.
So we need to let that out. After the dance party, people are going to have danced somewhere. And the thing about human nature that I would like to say as a psychiatrist is that wherever they are, people complain. That people actually never pay attention to what's working. It's like how the human mind is built. They pay attention to what isn't working. So after the dance party, they're going to have a lot of complaints. And they're going to write to Rabbi, they're going to write to somebody and say, this was terrible, this and this and this. And then Rabbi is going to be like, great, they're engaged with the world. And then Rabbi is going to say, what do we do next? So one of the things that we suggest at the University of Orange is what we call a stroll and scroll. Just take a stroll in the neighborhood and get people looking at their neighborhood again. Because we haven't been outside for a long time and stores have closed and this has happened and that's happened. There's a house burned down 2 blocks away from me. I didn't know because I haven't been outside. So we have to go see what's going on. And then we collect that in the scroll, we put it together. And then we say, okay, what should we start working on? What's the priority? So I think after the dance party, the complaints will come in. And thank God for the complaints, because that's when we can start to make things better.
I think that, when you talk about practical things, you really have to join the theology of openness and anticipating new revelation to the furniture in your building. So Judson removed its pews a long time ago, made a lot of things happen. Our particular model of hyper use of sacred space, because we believe there's a national and personal emergency. There is no peace inside us or outside of us. And so we want to use every inch we have to praise God's promise of peace. And so we overuse the space at Judson. A lot of congregations approach the adaptive reuse of sacred space as though, oh boy, maybe that'll give us an income stream or an energy stream. That's not the reason to do it. The reason to do it is that extravagant sense of God's power and possibility. And then we really have, we want to give our space away, and we want to jump out of that false binary that somehow our building is dirty or profane. It can be a remarkably useful spiritual instrument for God's work.
If I give just one simple program, we were talking recently with people in the UAE and people in Israel about planting a garden of peace, having a garden of peace in New York, because here you have countries joining together with respect for one another. I think it would be very, very inspiring if we could get communities to plant those gardens of peace in their areas, to come together and say, this is going to be our tree. This is going to be our garden. The word "our" becomes very important because, you know, we all were in our separate silos. And I think it's very, very important to impress upon one another that we can't succeed in finding our potential if we simply remain in our respective quarters, in our enclaves. We have to go out. We have to bring this message of hope and happiness to others. And therefore, I think it's really imperative that we start thinking of collaborative programming, that we have more pulpit exchanges, that we, you know, I was talking to someone and he said, you know, thanks to Zoom, I can team teach with a colleague in California. And just looking at, you know, I've come to know Reverend Donna a little bit. You know, I'd love to do a program with Judson where we come together and say, you know, let's look at this problem or this moment from our respective traditions. So I think the cooperation that this moment will provide to us is phenomenal. And we need to maximize, you know, that opportunity. And I'm hoping that we find programs that we join together. So it's not just one church, one synagogue in different places, but it's one community in one place.
And if I may, just ditto, say, why does every sacred site have only one congregation worshiping in it? At one point at Judson, we had 6 congregations working, as well as the Muslim Community Association, the network. It was wonderful. You experienced the vitality of all the traditions. And so many new immigrant congregations are renting space. Mm-hmm. And so many of us older immigrant congregations are paying electricity on empty space.
I think you're going to see changes there. I think you're going to find with less dependence on a building and more on programming, that people will welcome the opportunity to have renters to enhance income, but beyond enhancing the income, to enhance, again, this moment where we can be with one another. I walked by, I remember before COVID, walking by a synagogue that had rented. There's a Muslim group that meets on Friday and some other group that meets on Sunday. And there was a young people's group, very young. They must have been about, I think they were preschoolers. And it's an integrated preschool. And the kids on a Friday were coming out singing a Hebrew song. And I saw kids of different traditions singing a Hebrew song. And I said, I've never seen this before. And I said, you know, maybe, you know, crisis and opportunity always go together, the Chinese language. But I think all of us have learned that we've taken this moment of pain, and we've also said we can transform it into a moment of privilege and pleasure if we tap into each other's resources and say, I don't have all the answers. My father taught me the importance of the word maybe. Maybe I don't know, it all. Maybe you know more than I do. And I think we recognize that maybe we can find a better path where we can walk together.
William, I don't know if you are able to wade into this conversation.
Yes, you know, for me, the real stimulus of my thinking about church and community came when I visited with some other church leaders from New York State, the East Liberty Presbyterian Church. We went there in 2001. The East Liberty Church, of course, was traditionally an all-white church with people that had chauffeurs. They had no parking lot. The chauffeurs would wait in the circle in front of the church. But at one point, the pastor there began to ask the question with his leadership that what are we doing? Who are we serving? And who is in our community? Now, the community by then had become surrounded by African American and Latino residents who had all kinds of needs. And they made it a decision as a leadership to become community involved. And 90% of the white people in the church left. But the endowment didn't leave.
Wilkinson?
I'm going to take a break and I'm going to come back to the East Liberty model. Those of you who may have heard of it may want to talk a little bit about it.
Great. You know, as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm reminded of the trendy things that pastors have had to endure over the years at various denominational assemblies. And I can remember starting out that we went to an assembly where we were taught church growth theory, which was that churches grow by asserting their own identity and attracting other people who are like them. And then we got this this whole elaborate thing about how you could have 4 different worship services with different music styles to, you know, appeal to, you know, a particular audience. But it was all really, church growth was really tied up in a kind of a institutional self-absorption where people fixated on their identity. And I think denominations also fell into this, where we all ran away from New York City and 475 New York, and we all set up our own denominational shingles across the country to assert our identity. And I think that that has not served us well, because I think that we find joy, we find life when we get over ourselves and we really seek to embrace the diversity which is around us. I don't know if that struck a chord at all with anyone.
Well, I'm always interested in the word trendy because, you know, I like to wear up to the minute clothing and, you know, I like to be on the inside of trends. But I do think that, Peter, you're onto something there about is this whole newly rising interest in buildings trendy? And it's certainly born of the emergency of so many congregations not being able to manage their buildings or like their buildings. I wrote a farce called, I'm having a bad time in my relationship with my church building. Do I need therapy? You know, it just doesn't meet my needs anymore. Do I need therapy? And I do think that we are in a national emergency about what to do with our sacred space. And in case you haven't noticed, the trends for the last 60 years have been towards increasing secularization, both by the way the population votes with its feet in terms of religious observance, and the way more closed-minded, to put not too nice a face on it, closed-minded religious, more tribal experiences are more popular. I don't think this is a trend. I think it's the real thing. And there's going to be real change in what happens to religious buildings. I would like them to stay alive, to provide for congregations, and to care for their communities. I don't think that's trendy. I think that for me, that's gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. Mindy, you've spent a lot of time looking at the interface of architecture and design and how that impacts on people's mental and spiritual health. And so it seems like this architectural crisis is not just rooted in our church structures, but in our communities as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. in a deeply fractured society, it's the deepest thing is the fracture, that we're broken apart from each other. So people thinking they should flee a neighborhood because they don't like who's moving in is a symptom of this deep fracture. So how do we begin to bridge that? I think the first part of that is that we have to acknowledge how serious the problem is. Very serious problem to have a nation where people don't really profoundly broken apart from each other to the extent that we are. It's obvious when we think about Congress. The Republicans and the Democrats can't have a conversation where they come to agreement. The Republicans won't talk to the Democrats. That's ridiculous, but you can't have a healthy society on that basis. So how do we get past that? How do we open things up again? So I think that every organization, and this certainly includes all the congregations, has a role to play in saying, the question, what is ours to do? What's the piece of this we can take? So already the dancing on the streets and then peace gardens. Every community, every church many churches have a little bit of lawn. Can they have a community garden, or could they help start a community garden somewhere else in the neighborhood? Or somewhere else in their city with other people, not just congregations, but all the organizations of the city. In Orange, New Jersey, which is my hometown, there are 16 congregations around Main Street. And all of those play a role and should play a role in working together and helping create a strong community and a strong Main Street. So there's an endless list of things we could do. But if we stay in a kind of, not really thinking about each other, not looking outward, we won't do them. And it actually doesn't matter where we start, it matters that we start.
Peter, can I just take,
Yeah.
there's a moment, this is a moment for us also to look at the pain of the Asian community. And I was on a Zoom call the other day, and one of the most upsetting, disturbing stories was there were a number of members of the Asian community who said that when their parents walk down the street now, they keep their faces down because they're afraid they're going to get attacked. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be engaged with that community. Professors, you say, not just to stay within, but to reach without, and to invite people into our midst, and to say, you belong to us, we belong to each other. I think sometimes, the pain of others presents us with a moment where we can be somewhat healing. Look, I remember after Charlottesville, there was a group of Christians that formed a perimeter around the synagogue there. And there were a group of us, different faiths, formed a perimeter around the Islamic Center because there was an attack at Christchurch, New Zealand. I think we can learn that all of us know the pain of being excluded, and I think our challenge now is to include the excluded, and we can do that by widening the spaces, by expanding the reach, by pushing the walls further outward, and to saying that, our house of worship, what we say is a home of prayer for all peoples, but it's got to be a home that where people feel very comfortable being there, even if they don't come to pray. There are different names for a synagogue, for example, house of entering, house of gathering, house of learning. So I think we have to maximize the space so that people will enter and feel, I belong here. I don't have to put my head down when I come here.
I just want to, if I may, I just want to say that Reverend Wilkinson isn't participating as actively as he would because he's getting vaccinated. And this is wonderful. And the priority of all of our lives is to get vaccinated and get everybody vaccinated. And one of the things that's on the table is we have to get the whole world vaccinated. And the US and the rich countries are being very greedy about the vaccines and protecting patents for the drug companies. And so the issue of it becomes a very crucial issue, because if there's a whole country someplace else that's not vaccinated, then the COVID will just create variants that'll bounce back to us and break through our vaccines. So we have to urgently get everybody vaccinated. And congratulations, Reverend Wilkinson, for getting vaccinated. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, the East Liberty Church at that point decided that they were going to become a missional church. That is to say, they were going to share everything that they had with the community around them. They were going to be a center in the community that they honored. And so they began to first rent to a homeless shelter, then they rented to a food bank, and then they transferred ownership of these institutions in their building so that their building became a condominium rather than the church that they owned. Then they bought a local movie theater and started a community arts and music program. So they really were embodying what we call now missional church. Shared participation, shared leadership with the community in the church itself, shared vision, shared budget. No fixed budgets, always a flexible budget based on the priorities that the community and the church worked out. And then finally, they really worked on being a part of the community that their faith had called them to be. I think to me, this really is the model. And the thing is, it's not noblesse oblige. This is really a recognition that we didn't own this, we didn't create this. It was always all of us. How do we then, from like what Mindy said, from where we're at, begin to build or lift up that vision of the beloved community, the overall community. And it may not look glorious as it begins, but after a while it becomes powerful, and then you have new partners, and that becomes even more powerful. And then as you change your building, for instance, as an example, then you join others in calling for other landlords to change their buildings, and called as Tiffany from Pace Law School would say, with community planning, it becomes a part of your ministry. It's that growing piece. That's why I responded to Mindy's urban alchemy, because we can really make gold out of things that don't look like gold.
Another related dimension to all of this is the necessity for congregations to get out there and address structural inequities, economic inequities, racial inequities in their community. You know, in New York City and in other communities as well, you know, there's that push towards gentrification, or as Donna said, as fond of saying, gentrification's kissing cousin is racism. And a lot of times congregations are really reluctant to address these structural problems. I mean, some would argue in New York City, it's with all its diversity, it can be highly segregated in many ways, or that's certainly true in Albany, where, you know, I'm located. And congregations need to have a lot to say about how their communities are planned and what sort of housing gets financed, and how does that housing look, by the way? Does that housing, is that just a box, or is this helping to promote psychological health and interconnection? So do you find that congregations are willing to embrace these kinds of questions, or what might cause the reticence to get involved in this? Could we become agents of segregation rather than integration?
You know, Peter, someone said those who close their eyes never see tears. And I don't think we're not allowed to close our eyes to the pain of other people. That's not what our faiths teach us. You have to go out and see what is happening and see how you can make a difference. And I think for too long, we have said too little, many of us, about the real struggles that people are having out there. We were content being inside our buildings. We knew we were safe, but we didn't go out into other areas to see what is happening there. So I think once again, this provides us with an opportunity to fulfill a commitment that we say on the inside of our sanctuaries that now we have to see on the outside when we walk out there. So I would hope that people will become more engaged. I know that there are congregations that are seeing, for example, developers coming into their areas and saying to them, you know, we can build a high rise here. We can give you 2 or 3 floors for your congregation, and you can have a steady flow of income. And that's very tempting. That's very appealing, because rather than struggle to raise funds, you now have this source that will be replenished every year. So the question becomes, yes, we want to maintain our own spiritual identity, but we can't lose sight of our responsibility to the other who's not able to fulfill his or her own needs. So it's a conflict, Peter. It's really a conflict that we have to address. How do we resolve that conflict of staying strong and now ameliorating the pain of others and keeping them strong as well?
Rabbi, one of the things that Mindy's strengthening the region concept that she has in her urban alchemy process, that's extremely important. One of the dangers of a church sort of using its building is to think that that's it, we're done. If they look at their building while they join others in looking at the neighborhood, while the people in the neighborhood look at other parts of the region and ask the question, what's the impact? What's the real problem? What are the real development questions that can help us be connected and revitalize ourselves, or continue to deepen our vitalization? But I think that's the key. It's messy. The old image of the straight line and the arrow. In between the beginning of that line and the arrow is all kind of directions. But there has to be the building of that common vision, which only comes from talking to folks, working with folks, finding a way to get along with them when you didn't really like them in the first place. And then finally recognizing, oh my gosh, they are also human. They also belong to God, all of them, no matter who they are. And then you move together. And it may be a slow process, but it will build over time.
Donna?
Donna, you're on mute.
Our business is to open each other's hearts. That's our fundamental business. That's what it's about. And I use the word closed religious institutions on purpose in my little opening remark, because, before Trump, I used to say, I'll never call somebody a liberal or a conservative or demean a Democrat or a Republican again. I'll just say, I don't like closed people and I love open-minded people. And I always would then say, and I even know some Republicans who are very open-minded and some Democrats who are very closed-minded. Mix it up a little bit, make a space for people to be open, their open selves. I found that to be a hard thing during Trump. I mean, it was a genuine first-class spiritual crisis for me, because I really did see categories of people, and I'm praying to get over it. But finding a way to have the dancing experience, the praising experience, the ritual experience, the crying experience together opens the hearts large enough to say no to the developer who's going to give you a good deal when you might be able to build affordable housing. You might be able to be just a little bit on the side of the angels because you are just a little more open-minded. So that's what I really think we need to do, is to open people's minds and hearts.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Mindy, because I think you've written about this. What do you say to that congregation that has struggled to maintain itself now has this opportunity, at the same time is being told, well, you can't simply think about your own strength. You got to look to empower others. What's the best argument you can make?
Well, we had this crisis in our congregation at First UU, and it took us a year of very difficult discernment to come to the answer. And we were very helped by one of the UU ministers who came and consulted with us, who said, look, the purpose of church is to serve community. And the greatest asset you have is that you use your buildings. You own your buildings. And if you use your buildings to help community, you'll rebuild your congregation. So this helped us a lot. It created a hopeful vision of our future. If the congregations are struggling, I think, we concluded that we had faith, but we didn't have any works. And faith without works is dead. Our congregation was dead because we weren't doing anything as a congregation to be helpful. We didn't understand what our role was. So now that we understand what our role is and we're playing our role, it's still a small congregation, but it's very lively. It's full of life. So I think there's no way around the period of discernment of what is God's will and what is ours to do in making the world that God envisioned for us. I don't think there's any way around that. It's very hard work, and it takes a lot of people coming in from the outside cheering you on to get to a good conclusion. That was our experience.
So when Mindy gave her lecture at Union, and you can see this lecture on the New York State Council of Churches website, nyscoc.com, on the YouTube channel. She really sort of inaugurated for us a way of thinking about development. And if I could say, for the Council of Churches and Bricks and Mortals and the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative and the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing, one of the reasons that we got a grant from Trinity Church Wall Street was that we really wanted to cut down on this bifurcation between your self-preservation and serving your community. In fact, these two things are fundamentally linked. And if the church doesn't think about that interconnection and develop its own sense of mission and really understands the possibilities and strengths as its property, what happens is that a developer can come in and do that imagining for them, and usually end up with something which is not which is maybe not missionally as consistent, but also might not really even be as helpful as it could be financially for the congregation. And so often what we have in congregations is this bifurcation between the building and mission, as if these two things are separate, when in fact they are fundamentally linked. And if you don't approach it in that way, congregations will end up maybe getting a deal with a developer which is less than what they could have gotten had they done that pre-work. And that's really the space that we try to operate in terms of pre-development. Okay, one more reaction maybe, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
You know, Peter, I think one of the key things here is there are congregations that are operating, talking to themselves, but not talking to others. In other words, you know, a developer comes in, the board meets and says, oh, this is a great deal for us, but there's been no real expansion for the discussion. I think one of the things you have suggested is that we create committees of expertise to come in to talk to these congregations and say, look, there are opportunities here you may be overlooking, and we would like to suggest the following to you as you consider going forward. And I think once again, we recognize that we don't have all the answers if we just stay within our four walls, but we have more answers when we talk to one another. So hoping that the organization can say to the community, please talk to us. I want you to hear another option that might be a better option for you, that would help you both find, grow physically, but also grow fiscally. They're not necessarily in conflict with one another if you do it right.
Okay, good. Well, we're going to move to the Q&A portion of our gathering here, and I'm going to I see questions in the chat and questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with one we have in the Q&A that's posed to us by Reverend LaDonna Clark, and it says, what are the panelists' suggestions to include more young people in these conversations and in our outreach to community?
I'll tell you that one of the best things we have done at Judson is to create early morning dance parties for kids who want to dance sober. And you'd be surprised how many come and how quickly the word goes out. And they've been really wonderful ways to welcome people who might never be interested in as we like to say, darkening the door of a church. What a concept. I think that free parties, once we can do things again, are a great idea. You could never imagine a young person coming at 11 a.m., the perfect time for teenagers and young people to do anything without their having had some positive experience in the space first. So entry level, fun things.
I think one of the things we don't do well is consult with young people as to some of the things they'd like to see. I've been on a committee with a number of young people who are part of the youth advisory of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. And they talk about their experiences, their encounters with police. And I have to tell you, it is a learning moment for me and for many of the other adults in listening to them and hearing some of their recommendations and how they would address some of the problems that they see within the police department. And I always think that we as adults, we know what's best for others, and we don't do enough listening. I think it was Reverend Wilkinson who quoted the Shema before, which means to hear, to listen. And I think we have to do a better job. And before we start imposing programs, on others, why don't we talk to them and say, what are some of the things we could be doing that you would find meaningful? Because I think we'll learn from the young people as to some real possibilities where we can bring them in terms of development of our communities and congregations.
In Rochester, New York, one of the ways that we have been trying to involve the young people and actually learn from the young people and let them lead us. There's an organization, Rabbi Joseph, that grew up in Boston, Mass, the Center for Teen Empowerment. And they have a branch in Rochester. And basically what they do is they give kids a job, writing poetry, learning to speak and sharing their stories in a number of contexts. And so now we have maybe 25 or 30 congregations of various religions in our area that sponsor teen empowerment, that invite them in to teach us and to learn from us and to be supported. And these kids, they all go off to college or some other job. They become in the 2 or 3 years they're involved with teen empowerment ambassadors for the things that we've been talking about. In our own congregation, we have a wing of our building from the old days of having lots of kids in the church, an education wing. And one of our parishioners, who doesn't come much, but he's involved in city planning in the town, said, Pastor, if you can get people to come from the different churches to work together to sponsor something that's not so doctrinal for young people, I'll pay for it. And so what we're trying to do now is root some work with young people in the Charter for Compassion, the golden rule that we all with written religions can relate to in one form or another, almost literally. And to let a secular, so to speak, but values-oriented kind of meeting place, this conversation place, develop out of our building to involve young people, regardless of their denominational and religious background.
No.
Okay. Mindy, I don't know if you want to take a crack at this.
No, I thought those were great answers. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, great. So here's a related question that comes to us from Taylor Aiken. It says there are a lot of young people interested in real estate and public policy. And the beauty of Bricks and Mortals and other similar organizations is that they engage all these stakeholders in a congregation framed both in terms of values and value. We're certainly seeing from a lot of young folks intense activism around housing policy across the state, but most specifically in New York City. It's probably one of the areas that is so central to the mayoral campaign right now. But a group called Housing Justice for All has been really involved in this whole housing justice arena. Certainly, the council churches and Bricks and Mortals and many others. But that whole question of real estate and wealth and access to housing is very animating to younger people. We want to pick up on that.
What's so important and this links back to our earlier conversation about what do churches do with their buildings, and if developers show up, what do you do with the developers, is that we're in what a lot of analysts have called a housing famine. That in the United States, we have no way to build low-income housing for low-income people. Affordable housing hits a higher sector than the actual poor people. So the deficit is huge. And this puts pressure on the whole housing market. So young people coming out with entry-level jobs can't afford where to live. So they should be leading and bringing this to the attention of all of us. But it's not an obscure or debatable fact that we're in a housing famine. And everybody who can, and certainly congregations can have a voice in this, needs to be aware that human health depends on housing. It's one of those fundamental things. And a lot of people don't have secure, affordable housing. So how to be part of that, how to think about that in your own area, and how to connect to other groups that are working on that, I think is very essential kind of social action and social justice that fits well with the mission of many congregations.
I was talking to one of the politicians recently, and he said, and Errol Lewis, who's a commentator here in New York, a well-known commentator, has said, you got to get young people to engage in the process, the decision-making process at an early age. There are community boards that function in various areas that need new thinking, that need, fresh thinking. And I think we have to encourage young people to be part of it, even though they may be somewhat negative, same old, we've heard this before, but to impress upon them that if we're going to try some new ideas, it's going to come from them too. And they have a voice that needs to be heard. And I think we as faith leaders need to, as much as possible, get them to participate in those active boards, so that very often the critics become the problem solvers, and I think we can help make a difference there as well.
One of the ways in the Rochester area that we're learning to connect to what the rabbi is saying, with the controversies that we have around criminal justice in our area, with Daniel Prude's dying at the hands of police and mental health kind of issues involved. They grew up in support of our Police Accountability Board, an elected board, a coalition of about 20 organizations called the Police Accountability Board Alliance. And it is run by young people.
Right.
And so one of the lessons would be to take the old public health idea that you go to the people, learn from them, work with them, and act with them. Go to where the young people are organizing around issues and join them. Let them feel your presence, and then invite them to join you as they might have interest in doing when they see what you're doing, because you have been supporting them.
Right. By the way, Peter, I just want to admire Reverend Wilkinson. Had a shot and 20 minutes later get into a car. Now, when I had a shot, I was afraid to walk down the street. So you see the great faith that
well, they said wait in the store for 15 minutes. So I'm parked outside the store.
Oh yeah, you're not moving.
More than 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because
Yes, impressive.
yeah.
Great. Well, another question that we have here comes to us from Ugochi. I'm sorry, just a minute. Uku. I'm sorry, I kind of botched the pronunciation there, but he's asking, what are your thoughts about efforts to landmark sacred spaces, and what can landmark congregations do about the impacts of the restrictions, and what are the possibilities? And a related question or observation comes from Donna Scopper about how bricks and mortals, and I would also add to that the council churches and the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative and the Assembly are really seeking to bring that question to the fore with our mayoral candidates right now about landmarking, air rights, development, and so on. So I don't know also if Jason LeBay is still on this call, but he might have some things to contribute to this as well. Landmarking.
Frankly, I've never met anybody who's happy with the landmark designation. Every time I meet people who have this landmark, they say, "Oh, you think it's a blessing? It's not," because we're so restricted. So I think it's got to be re-examined before it really becomes such an impediment for so many people.
And if Jason can answer, that would be best. But let's just say that it's a perfect example of legislation that tried to do good that went bad.
Right, right.
It would be something very important for a mayoral candidate to ride with, because it would help people, really would. I guess Jason is bugged off. Let me just say on his behalf that this is a very complicated issue. Politicians are scared of it, but they're more scared of overdevelopment, which is what Gail Brewer, who is very much a partner in all of this work, would say to you. And by overdevelopment, she means the gentrification and it's racism, that's what she's against. So you have to find a way through the landmarks minefield as a smart real estate person, which, by the way, very few of us on this call are, and therefore we need technical help. And that's why we are so grateful to the lawyers and developers, the good developers who work with us, and architects. So we be in touch directly with Bricks and Mortals, and we'll put you in with the group of people working on this matter.
Peter, just tying some of the pieces that that Donna and Rabbi have just talked about, and going back to what Mindy said about it's hard work, hard work. one of the things we found in the Rochester area is that building the Rochester communities for transforming society, faith communities of various religions coming together to ask these justice questions and working together to both represent our congregations, educate our congregations, and encourage our congregations to be forces for justice in the communities around them. That has been a really, the whole idea of community organization as the underbelly of congregational ministry outside the church has been very helpful. One partner organization has had a certain experience and they share it with you, or together you join some third group of at least 2, 4, 5, 10 congregations strong. That is really, I think, one of the things that we can do together. It may be, for instance, that your congregation has a certain consciousness about housing and the physical nature of the community and what needs to happen, but you don't have the building. But maybe somebody else does, and maybe some other organizations do. We recently had a conversation with the Quakers in with the Presbyterians at Third Presbyterian Church in Rochester, and they have a big program of doing regional schools. And we said to them, "Have you been working with the local schools in Rochester to not only do the metropolitan thing, but to have that same energy and partnerships working on what's happening in the city of Rochester itself?" So sometimes it's about really connecting ourselves and connecting what we're doing or what we think we're interested in and seeing something new happen.
Okay. Anybody else? So, there are lots of tools at your disposal that we in this partnership with Brooks and Mortals offer to you, along with the collaborative and the council of churches and so on, to really wade into this pre-development landmarking space. And so we really urge you to reach out to all of us, to delve into this question. Landmarking should not be the kiss of death. For congregations, it should be, in its best sense, facilitating community and connection, but that takes resources and thoughtfulness. And one idea is, if you're going to landmark a congregation, then the community and the city can pay for all the upkeep to make that designation a reality, or to live into that designation. Okay. I wasn't able to get to all of these questions, but I do have one more from David Avilis, who asks, what are houses of worship doing when they are developing property, and are they asking that those developments be built by people in the communities, or is this a vehicle for economic empowerment and jobs in their communities?
I think this is one of the reasons why we have to open the doors to hear others. These decisions are made sometimes behind closed doors. It's people on the board who decide, and there's no input from others who could be positively impacted by decisions. So I hope going forward that we stress to our respective congregations that they're not just a congregation. As I said at the beginning, you're a holy community, and holiness means you have to try to stand a little bit higher. We have a custom, when we say holy in the synagogue, we stand on the soles of our feet. We lift ourselves up a little bit. And I think holiness is something we don't talk about enough, but it applies to so many areas of our growth. And when we talk about housing, holy housing should be part of the conversation. How do we get more people to benefit from that kind of possibility? Reverend, you're not going to stay in that car all day, are you? I mean,
No, this is actually our wheelchair van. In our family, we have biological, adopted, and foster. So this is our wheelchair van.
okay.
We've got, and but no. But you know what? I wouldn't have missed this conversation.
Well,
As much as one brings to these kind of conversations, we learn constantly. We hear things that are going to help all of us from the interactions and the things that are shared.
yeah. And Peter, could you mention Mindy's
Go ahead.
book so we all know we all can get a copy of that book?
Yeah. Mindy, what would be the best way for people to purchase these? Maybe not on Amazon, although you can buy them all on Amazon.
Let me just say a word about holy housing, because I love that. We should put that into our marketing tools. A lot of times churches don't get the help they need from developers, architects, lawyers, and they make mistakes. But one of the big reasons they make mistakes, I don't know if this applies to synagogues, but I know churches, is they go cheap. So Judson, a landmark church, has had 3 roofs in the last 100 and maybe 30 years, whatever it is. And each time we had to petition, we had to say, we can only do a cheaper roof. This time we did a 100-year roof that is red tile, like the original Italian tile. Why? Because it lasts 100 years. I can't tell you as a pastor for almost 45 years how often the electricity broke in one of my parishes because somebody got their brother-in-law to come in and do it under code. I can't tell you enough of those kind of silly stories that where we go cheap or we go internal and we don't act like we're rich, we act like we're poor. Well, I suppose we are poor, sort of, but when you make stupid mistakes, you just get poorer and poorer. So I'm very excited about the new initiative that Trinity Church has made possible. And I'm going to throw it to Peter or Mark, who's still, I think, on the call, which is really honoring pre-development funds for congregations that might have the capacity to do affordable housing well, but don't even know how to find out if they do. Okay? And Mindy, I think you're right. Affordable is extremely hard to build, but what if you have the land already? What if you have the land already? Does that make a difference? So Peter, take it away on that project.
Yeah, I would just say the most important dollars and also the hardest dollars are the dollars that congregations need at the beginning to do this professional kind of analysis, which is not paid for by a developer, but is unencumbered money that allows a congregation to do the zoning architectural analysis and get expert legal counsel to represent them and only them in this process. And so that's really the space we try to operate in. We like working with developers, but there's a time and place to work with developers later in the process. And in a way where you're negotiating really good agreements with them so that everybody's interests are being served. Okay, we have about 3 minutes here, so
just note that Mindy Foley will have put in the chat a connection to the publisher that she recommended.
Yeah, that's really great. These are fabulous books, and you can also hear a lot of her lectures on YouTube. Just put her name in and she's all over the place. So it's just really good. And you can also see her lecture on our YouTube channel at the Council of Churches. All
Just
right.
in closing, it's really important that we've talked a little bit about sort of the outside mission of the church, But in this year of people being so badly battered, the internal mission of healing and restoration and helping people keep their hearts open. When people are battered, they close their hearts. So helping them open their hearts again and join in the flow of the universe is not to be lost sight of. It's just and I'm speaking as a psychiatrist, the level of pain of everybody in this awful year is not to be left out of the equation. And I thank you all so much for what your churches and congregations and synagogues and everything do to help us keep breathing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mindy. Are there some other closing remarks here from? Yep.
Inner peace and outer peace are different sides of the same coin. They're not opposed to each other. They propagate each other.
All right.
Okay, I want to say thank you to all. This has been an enlightening moment.
Yes.
And let's, when a young child does something which he or she enjoys, the reaction is, let's do it again. So let's continue to have these moments of learning and listening. I think they're very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. If we all go back home and write down the first thoughts that we're bubbling with from today's conversation and use that in our sharing with our communities, that'll be wonderful.
All right.
That's great. Well, thank you everybody for participating. We try to do these seminars from time to time. You can see a lot of the previous ones at the New York State Council of Churches website and also on Bricks and Mortals website. They're called Who's My Neighbor seminars that really take you through all of the pre-development work. And we really look forward to our continued collaboration going forward. We want to do a lot more of these educational opportunities. Maybe we'll persuade Joe to give us dance lessons in the
Absolutely. Are you kidding? Break dancing is my specialty.
Remember that Rumi said,
yeah.
that God is the Lord of the dance.
Right.
Yeah.
And that if we all see our living as the dance, then we can look for the partners we need and take the steps in the dance that we need to take.
Right. And Reverend, let's remind them, Boston strong.
There you go.
They need that Boston expertise.
And then I just wanted to also say, if you are a congregation that needs some specific guidance on what to do with your property and along the principles which we've outlined here, so please be in touch with Bricks and Mortals, with New York State Council of Churches, the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, any of those, the Assembly on Housing and Homelessness and Housing, and we all work together to try to offer pre-development assistance, including access to resources and grants, which can help you do this pre-development work. All right, Kate, maybe I'll just return it back to you.
Yeah, just thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And please, I dropped the website in the chat, but it's bricksandmortals.org. And thank you so much to all the panelists for your expertise and wisdom and for taking the time to be with us today. And thanks again for everyone for taking the time to join us. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Mindy, thank you.
Great. Thank
Stay
you,
safe.
everybody.
Stay safe.